Today, we're talking about organizational change and how we can manage it. Needless to say, organizations today are going through many changes, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But our focus is really going to be on planned change because organizations do, in fact, have agency in this matter, and they see what's going on around them, or they see an opportunity, and they think about what they're going to do with that. Prior to the recession, companies were spending about 8% of revenues on change efforts. That includes restructuring, training, all sorts of different kinds of approaches to change. That's revenues, 8% of revenues. So that's a significant amount of money. Obviously, that's dropped somewhat, but I expect that there's been a significant resurgence since we've come out of the recession as well. Our approach is going to be based on the force field analysis. One of the things that we like about this is that it gives us a way of analyzing what ways we might improve our change process. That is, we can speed up our change, we can figure out what might help our change, we can figure out what processes are going to push against our change, and so on. So a force field analysis is the process of determining which of the elements of the work situation are going to drive the change and which of them are going to resist it. Once we've got that figured out, needless to say, we can work on the separate elements. The equilibrium between these sets of forces are going to produce no change. So if we end up in a stalemate situation, our organization is not going to go forward, and of course, based on the environment, may very well go back. There are generic forces toward change and generic forces against it, so we'll talk about that for just a minute. We know that there are a lot of changes in the workforce out there, diversity being one, age changes being another significant one. We see people exiting from top-level jobs in organizations because of the baby boomer exodus, and we see perhaps a gap in the leadership based on that. We also see, of course, pressure from the bottom of the age distribution, that is the millennials, looking to move up the organization and perhaps not quite yet seeing all the space they would like to see in that. Technology changes what we do. Of course, we know that technology now replaces people in the workforce at a great rate. We also know that it changes how the process whereby we work, so that's going to change what the organization is doing. Global economic changes are becoming much more rapid. So we see the entrance of transition economies. They become competitors of ours. We also see events like the Great Recession, of course, changing what happens in organizations. And organizations that don't really respond to these things are perhaps going to be put out of business, perhaps going to see a reduction in what they do. Waiting is generally not good, so organizations that respond sooner to things like social trends, global political, environmental changes, organizations that respond earlier are likely to be more successful than those that sort of wait to see what happens. Needless to say, sometimes we get it wrong, and the event that we're looking at and the choice we make about our strategy in dealing with it can turn out not to be the correct one. Generic forces resisting change often come from people. So people fear change because of some very real and relevant reasons. It leads to uncertainty for them. It leads to a potential loss of power. That is, the expertise and knowledge that they built up over the years is no longer valuable. And of course, restructuring can lead to job loss, a demotion. A sense of uncertainty is the least of it. So there's going to be some fear associated with change efforts. We also know that people are creatures of habit, so inertia drives a lot of what we do. We learn how to do something, and then we pretty much do it that way forever. So unconscious patterns of behavior revert to exactly what we have always done, and that means, of course, that change is a difficult thing for us. Some people have had experiences with past changes that were bad. Organizations can realize a loss of trust through that. And of course, we can just get tired of it when the pace of change is very rapid. And lastly, the change may not be understood. If organizations simply say, we're going to restructure, now you're going to do this instead of that, clearly that's going to be more of a hurdle for the employees than if you explain what's going on. Let me give you an example of how we might look at a force field diagram. This is a force field change diagram for a specific change that happened many years ago at the Darla Moore School of Business here at the University of South Carolina. So the forces on the left-hand side of your screen are for change, and on the right-hand side are against change. We had a brand new dean who thought it would be nice to have a different kind of program, a one-year MBA program, which we actually have now, but this was a long time ago. And he thought, well, this would be really good. We see a dip in enrollment. Maybe people don't like the program that we're currently offering. The dip in enrollment was representative of 2 years, so you might question whether that's enough data to make that prediction. He also thought that it would be useful if we had people going to school in the summer more, because butts in seats translates to money and empty seats doesn't. Of course, he never really explained how making the program shorter was going to end up creating money when people weren't going to be here as long, but that's one of the many things he didn't exactly explain. Our impression was, of course, that many of his reasons for making these changes were to make a mark at the school. He was new, he needed to show that he was going to do something different than had come before, and this MBA program was going to be his signature event. Against the change, we see university rules. The university at that time was definitely not in favor of having many different structures for their schedules, although, again, that's something else that we do a lot of now. The dean had not asked the university whether they would agree to his schedule change, which you might guess might be a major thing. Faculty were not particularly supportive of it, and I'm sure you can guess why. Faculty are 9-month employees. If all of a sudden you're going to ask them to work 12 months, then you need to either pay them more or change what they do. Of course, one of the things faculty get evaluated on is their research, and if they don't have any time to do that because they're working 12 months out of the year, then that's obviously going to create a situation where you either have to change what the faculty job is, that is remove research, or you have to find a way to address that. The dean never addressed that issue either. One of the things you may know about curriculum issues is that faculty either vote them up or vote them down. So the faculty control the curriculum, and if they're not going to vote for this program, it's not going to go forward. The last thing is kind of interesting. You see a very small arrow up there for how others do it, which is our basic benchmarking. So we did some investigation into how other people were doing this and found that at that time almost nobody was doing it. You can interpret that in a number of different ways, but in fact it turned out to be very non-influential in the whole process on either side of things. As much as we tell people they should benchmark against excellent competitors, we were not really too concerned about what other people were doing at that time. So you can see the size of the arrows indicates how much pressure each element is putting on the change. There's some arrows that are large for change, and then there's some that are large against it. Ultimately, I'm sure you can guess what happened here. Since the dean did not address the forces against change, there was no change. The faculty voted down the initiative, and we continued with our standard program offerings for another 8 years. The issue here, of course, is that if you knew this information, if you thought about this, collected some data, made a chart for yourself, you would know, here's 2 things I really need to do if I'm the dean of the Darla Moore School of Business. Again, somebody who left many years ago. If I'm that person, I have to deal with the university in terms of its bureaucracy to see if my program will work, and I have to win the faculty over somehow. Those are the 2 key things I'm going to have to do to make my program work. If I don't choose to address those, it's likely not to happen. Okay, so let's think a little bit about what we've got here. If we think about using a diagram like this, we can address those things that are pushing against the change we want to implement. We can do that through communication. We want to tell people what we're doing. We want to explain it to them, how, when, where, what. And we want their participation. We want them to explain how it's going to work for them. So to the extent that I can include the faculty, that I can include the university bureaucracy, our specific example might have gone a lot better. Building relationships with those groups was key to making sure that that initiative went ahead, and of course it died immediately on the vote of the faculty. We also need to be fair and consistent and respectful in carrying out our changes. People are upset, especially if they happen to be losing a job. We don't want to be anything less than respectful, in part because it's the right thing to do, but also in part because it's going to reduce the likelihood that people are going to sue over a change that they don't feel is appropriate. We also need to think about evaluating change. We can evaluate change with the notion that we need to know whether it was for the good or not. And we can do it in a number of different ways. So we can evaluate how the intervention was carried out. That is the process of change. And you can use action learning to approach that. And that means, of course, that we're going to consult the participants. We're going to collect data along the way. We're going to collect data at the end and so on. And we can determine whether it was carried out in a approved manner, that is the way we expect change should be best carried out. But we also care about the actual impact more, and that occurs at multiple levels. So affective change, participants' attitudes towards the intervention, this is something that we do all the time. We ask people how they feel about a course, a training program, a change in their job. It's also not as useful as other kinds of information in determining whether the intervention was a success, whether that change was actually a success. It just tells me whether the participants like it or not. Do a little better if I get people to learn new skills and then I measure that. I can measure whether they learned those new skills. We're still a little ways away from seeing behavioral change on the job, and that's our next option for measurement. Once we look on the job, it gets a little bit harder to measure because we're looking at actual behavior of what people are doing. We need to come up with metrics. We need to come up with observations that help us understand what's going on the job. Whether that behavior is changing based on what we have done in terms of our organizational change. Ultimately, we care about performance, sales, productivity, absenteeism, and organizational outcomes. These are hard to connect to specific changes sometimes for two reasons. One is they're very distal to what we changed. So if we give everybody a training program and then we measure ROA, well, it's probably a little bit far off to suggest we're going to see a strong relationship there. The other thing is, of course, that we really don't know when we change a whole lot of things at once, which piece of that caused the changes in the outcomes we care about. So our best bet is to look at a number of different changes and try and make a judgment based on that as regards the success of our intervention.